In this video, we are going to look at congruent triangles. Congruent triangles are two or more triangles that have the exact same size and shape. We already know the word congruent, and congruent means the same, right? So if I look at this triangle, CAB, that I'm going to highlight right here, if I were to take it and move it right on top of this other triangle, notice how everything matches up. These two triangles are the exact same size and the exact same shape. And when two triangles have the exact same size and exact same shape, then all of their sides and all their angles are going to match up as well. So, for example, if I look at side AB in this triangle, well, side AB is congruent to side DE. And then if I look at side BC, that's congruent to side FE. And lastly, if I look at the third side, CA, that's congruent to this third side, DF. So every side of this yellow triangle has an exact pair in the blue triangle. When I take CA and I move it over, now it lies right on top of FD. Not only are all three sides congruent, but all three angles match up too. So if I look at angle A matches up with angle D. Angle B is going to match up with angle E based on those congruent markings, and angle C we can now see is congruent to angle F. So these three sides and three angles are congruent in both triangles. When two triangles are congruent, all three angles and all three sides have a congruent pair. Now, what we call these is we call these corresponding parts. So the corresponding part to AB is side DE in the other triangle because they are congruent. So AB and DE are corresponding parts. Every side in this triangle has a corresponding side in the other triangle. Every angle in the yellow triangle has a corresponding congruent angle in the blue triangle. So that's another term that you'll hear throughout this unit. Now, whenever we go to write a congruence statement for the triangles, just like we would write angle AB is congruent to angle DE, right? This is a congruence statement. Now we're going to write congruence statements for triangles. So let's say I name this triangle up here with three letters, triangle ABC. It doesn't matter what I name this triangle. However, if I call it triangle ABC, then it is important what I call the blue triangle. And here's why. Every corresponding part has to match up. So if I look at angle A, we already know that angle A corresponds to angle D. They are congruent. So if A comes first, D has to come first in this name. And then B comes second. What corresponds to angle B? That would be angle E. So if B comes second, E has to come second. And lastly, if C comes last, then F has to come last because the angles go in the same order. So angle ABC has to go in order of DEF. Now, there's many different answers for this problem. I can name the first triangle anything I want to. If I wanted to do this, I could name this triangle BCA. But this time, if I'm calling it BCA, then I have to call this triangle whatever matches with B comes first. So E has to come first, and then since C comes second, F has to come second. And if A goes last, D has to go last. So there's many different ways we can write these congruent statements. The important part is, it doesn't matter what you name this one, but everything has to follow the same order. So let's try some examples. If I'm looking at number 1, I can call this triangle whatever I want to. Let's call it triangle NOT. If I call this triangle NOT, then N comes first, and N is 41 degrees, so A has to come first. Since O comes second, then C has to come second, which means T comes last, and so does B. What if I wanted to call this triangle TON? I could do it. That just means I have to call this triangle BCA. As long as N and A match up, O and C match up, and T and B match up. That's the important part. Pause this video and see if you can try number 2 and 3. Come up with an answer. All right, let's look at number 2. I'm going to call this first triangle LMN, which means I would have to call this one RTS. If your answer doesn't look exactly like mine, remember, that's okay. Because what if I called this NML? Then I would have to call this STR. Or I could do MLN, and this would be TRS. Any of these work, all because L and R match up, M and T match up, and N and S match up. For number 3, I see that all I have is D and H that are congruent, and G and F which are congruent. However, I do see vertical angles, which helps me a lot. So I'm going to call this DEG, which means I would have to call the second one HEF. Now, one thing I haven't mentioned yet is that not only do the angles match up, but if you put the angles in the right order, then something else cool happens. Let's look at 2 letters at a time. So if I look at the first two, DE and HE, well, in the 2 triangles, DE is congruent to HE. So it also tells me the sides that match up. What if I look at the second 2? EG and EF. EG and EF match up. That only got me 2 sides though. The third side comes from the first and the last letter. So DG is congruent to HF. And that's true for any of these examples. For example, ML and TR works. LN and RS works. MN and TS works. So this will help us as we go into these next types of problems. So I'm giving you a diagram and I'm telling you that triangle SUP is congruent to triangle GUH. If you're given this in a problem, you're given it for a reason. It's important. Because I want to match up the corresponding parts, but nothing's marked down here. So if I'm asking you for HGU, remember how we name angles with 3 letters? HGU? That's this angle right here. So in other words, it's angle G. Well, this is where I have to use this up here. What's angle G congruent to? Angle G is congruent to S because they're both the first letter. Okay, so if I wanted to name this angle with 3 letters to practice, I could call it PSU, or you could call it USP. Now, the difference here is first I was asking what is it congruent to. Now I'm asking you what is the measure of it. So let's think about this. Well, I have that H is 48, and I have that this angle down here is 73, and vertical angles tells me that this angle is 73. So the easiest way I can find angle G is by using angle sum theorem, 180 minus 48 minus 73. And when we do that, we get 59 degrees. Okay, now let's look at the bottom two. Now it's asking me for sides. So PS, what is PS congruent to? Well, based on my statement up here, PS, the first and last letters, must be congruent to HG. And then if I'm asking you for PS with no bar and an equal sign, that means I want the number. Well, if HG is 5 centimeters, that means PS is also 5 centimeters. Let's look at another example. So whenever I'm given this congruent statement, I need to use it. So if I want to find the values of x and y, let's start with x. Well, x is in this side length FG. So I need to find over in this triangle, what is FG congruent to? And that's where I use my statement. FG has to be congruent to AB based on my statement, which means x plus 1 has to equal 5. So when I solve this one-step equation, x is equal to 4. Now to find y is in this angle F. And based on my congruence statement, angle F is congruent to angle A, which means the measure of angle F is equal to the measure of angle A. So 2y equals 46. Solve this one-step equation, and y is equal to 23. So again, we couldn't finish this problem without using this statement. So if that statement is given to you, you have to use it. There's a reason why I give it to you. The last thing we need to talk about in this lesson is what we call the third angles theorem. And the third angles theorem tells me that if I have two triangles where I know two of the angles are congruent, that means the third angles also have to be congruent. And let's think about that. So over here I see that C is congruent to K and B is congruent to J. So let's just pick some numbers. Let's say C is 20. Well, that means K is 20. And then let's say B is 70. Well, that means J is 70 because they're congruent. Well, using what I know about triangles, the third angle has to sum up to 180. So if I take 180 minus 70 minus 20, that gets me 90. And if I take 180 minus 70 minus 20, that also gets me 90. So if two angles are the same, then the third angle has to be the same number because you're going to get the same number to add up to 180. So let's look at this in practice. Number 4, we're given this figure, and I know that these two angles are congruent to these two angles, which means automatically B has to be congruent to X. So if I use this triangle to find B, that would mean 180 minus 110 minus 30. So angle B is 40 degrees, which automatically means over here, X is 40, because B and T are congruent based on this theorem up above. In number 5, we have this figure right here, and all I'm telling you is that angle F and angle K are congruent. Well, that's only one angle. However, we have vertical angles. So there's my second angle. So if I know that F and K are congruent, and these two vertical angles are congruent, then without doing any extra work, I know that D and T also have to be congruent, which means X is 65. So that concludes our lesson on congruent triangles, the very first lesson. The important parts about this lesson, knowing that all three angles and all three sides will match up in both congruent triangles, and knowing how to write a congruent statement, and knowing how to use a congruent statement to match up the corresponding congruent parts.